Good evening, my friends. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a generally popular subject amongst spiritual people in general, people who are into the concepts of meditation in Buddhism, and this is known as Zen. And I want to talk about Zen because I think a lot of people have a lot of misinterpretations as to what Zen is. It's sort of turned into this buzzword that's used a lot to describe just a general, super relaxed, super chill, go with the flow kind of attitudes towards life. People describe others as being Zen or whatever. And there's nothing inherently wrong with this modernization of this term. But I think for people who are actually interested in the culture and the origins of what Zen actually is, it's important to look into the history and see where it actually comes from. So the main thing is that Zen, what you would know as Zen in the traditional aspects, is primarily popular in Japan. It's a form of Buddhism that's very popular in that country, but it originated in China during the Tang Dynasty. At the time, it was known as Chan, and then once it migrated into Japan, it became known as Zen. But it originated in China around 600 to 900 AD. That was when it started becoming more prominent in that era. And during that time, a lot of schools were developed in the Zen thought, and it wasn't what people might perceive Zen to be. A lot of people have a conception of Zen as being, super relaxed, super chill, super going with the flow. And in many ways, it was like that. But the reality of what Zen was that it was a hardcore religion. It was a hardcore discipline. It was very much based off of a hierarchy system. It was, a lot of it was kind of brutal. And it's important to recognize this because people go into these new age spirituality things without thinking that they need to actually put work into it. Like they think they can just get into a mindset of like, oh, I'll just go with the flow, and they'll attain enlightenment, or they'll attain a certain sense of joy and prosperity and all this other crap. The reality is that these paths to enlightenment or bettering yourself always require a lot of work. It requires a lot of discipline, and you don't just get it overnight. It's a lifetime of a lifetime of progress rather. And I'm going to be talking about specifically where I learned a lot about Zen Buddhism was in the Gateless Barrier, which is a translation to English from the Mumonkan, which is the main book in terms of Zen. If you want to know what real Zen is, get this book. I'm not sure. This is I got this at a used bookstore. The translation is supposed to be good, but there's all kinds of different translations you can find on Amazon or at the bookstore, what have you. But overall, I definitely recommend to read this if you're interested in those kinds of things, because it'll show you a real perspective of what Zen is. And it doesn't fuck around, especially with this book, because it's not, the problem with a lot of this new age Eastern philosophy that's become sort of very popular in the spiritual community, I guess you would say, is that it's looking at it from a very fluffy, cutesy, sparkly perspective, which is not getting into the reality of things, because a lot of people don't want to put in the work. They don't want to realize that it takes a long time to achieve a certain sense of enlightenment and prosperity in this art, basically. And at the end of the day, the reality of what these religions and these spiritual practices aim towards is not something that's sparkly and fun and cute it's more of a deeper understanding and acceptance of the way things are. And with that can come joy and happiness, but there's a long road of work, hardship, existentialism, whatever you want to call it. There's always going to be, for anyone who has a spiritual journey or what have you, there's always going to be a period in which you are going to suffer. In a sense, you're going to be overcome by a delusion until you reach a breaking point and you start building yourself from there. So what Zen is, essentially, borrowed a lot from Buddhism and also from Taoism, and they sort of melded them together during the Tang Dynasty. And so it's a very interesting religion because I wouldn't really categorize it under Buddhism or Taoism. It's sort of its own unique expression because unlike Buddhism, which originated from India, which is heavily tied in with Hinduism, and you can see this in Tibetan Buddhism if you study it, is that there's a lot of emphasis on gods and deities and praying and making sacrifices and a lot of very strict religious aspects. Zen is much more focused on the Taoist perspective, but taking the same principles from Buddhism. And what Taoism is teaching is accepting things as they are. It's very much a non-religious religion, even though it's categorized as a religion. There's no mention of God or, spiritual deities or anything like that. It's actually very scientific in nature, but since it's dealing with esoteric concepts like energy and chi and the universe and how everything is connected and the great source of all life and all this other stuff, it gets melded into religion, which I think is very ignorant. It's very ignorant that it's done that way. And Zen is sort of a nice middle ground between those two concepts of the very scientific and pragmatic view of Taoism and the more religious and I wouldn't say optimistic, but there is a sense of Buddhism in that there is this holiness, this otherworldly power, whereas Taoism is very much dealing with things as matter of fact, very much based in science. It's very similar to Western science in that way. However, it's coming from a more internal perspective that's not dealing with the material world specifically, but more on an energetic level. So let's get into this book so I can give you an example of some of the koans. What a koan is, it's basically like a little storyline that's like, a paragraph basically that, is supposed to inscribe some thought. And I'm just going to give you 4 examples here of the savagery. Maybe savagery is too harsh a word, but the intensity and that this religion practiced with the disciples that entered into this. So this is koan called Gute Raises a Finger. Master Gute, whenever he was questioned, just stuck up one finger. At one time he had a young attendant whom a visitor asked, "What is the Zen your master is teaching?" The boy also stuck up one finger. Hearing of this, Gute cut off the boy's finger with a knife. As the boy ran out screaming with pain, Gute called to him. When the boy turned his head, Gute stuck up his finger. The boy was suddenly enlightened. When Gute was about to die, he said to the assembled monks, "I attained Tenryu's Zen of one finger. I used it all through my life, but could not exhaust it." When he had finished saying this, he died. So overall, you can interpret that any way you want to. You can experience it in any way, but you will just see from this one example that this isn't a nice little comfy retreat where everyone drinks tea and they smile and they dance around and they go into the hot tub and they have a good time. It's a very structurally rigid, disciplinary sect of Buddhism. And people need to recognize that because it's important to understand the history. It's important to understand where all these concepts come from. I'm going to give another example here. Here we go. This is the most controversial one that I read that I thought was kind of excessive. All of them are pretty intense. Some of them are a lot more easygoing, but this one was like, okay, once the monks of the Eastern Hall and the Western Hall were disputing about a cat. Nansen, holding up the cat, said, "Monks, if you can say a word of Zen, I will spare the cat. If you cannot, I will kill it." No monk could answer. Nansen finally killed the cat. In the evening, when Joshu came back, Nansen told him of the incident. Joshu took off his sandal, put it on his head, and walked off. Nansen said, "If you had been there, I could have saved the cat." So, this is like, it's intense, These people really have a grasp on the transitory aspect of what life is, in that they at one point may value it, but at the other time, if someone dies, it's not a big deal, to the point where if they want to get a message across to someone, they'll kill a cat or an innocent life because they want to prove a point, which is excessive, obviously. But this is where Zen comes from. Nansen is a big Zen monk who's very famous within that sect. And, this is where all of that shit is coming from. All the Zen talk is coming from these aspects. Whether you agree with it or not is up to you. But, again, like I said, it's important to know. We have two more to read, and then we'll call it a night here. This one, Tozen gets 60 blows. So you already know what this one's about. When Tozen came to have an interview with Unman asked, "Where have you been recently?" "At Sado, master," Tozen replied. "Where did you stay during the last Ge period?" I don't know how to pronounce that. "At Hozu of Konan," replied Tozen. "When did you leave there?" "On the 25th of August," Tozen answered. Unman exclaimed, "I give you 60 blows with my stick." The next day, Tozen came up again and asked the master, "Yesterday you gave me 60 blows with your stick. I do not know where my fault was." Unman cried out, "You rice bag! Have you been prowling about like that from Kosei to Kanan?" At this, Tozen was enlightened. So, that was another thing about the Zen monasteries, is that the students would get beaten the fuck out of with sticks all the time. That was like a very normal thing. You can look this up. This was, that was what happened. If you didn't get Zen, your master would come with a fucking stick and just whack you on the head until you got it. It was hardcore. This isn't, this isn't a little fun retreat or something. And I'll give you the last one. This one actually I actually enjoy as a concept, but this one's called Unman's Shit Stick. A monk asked Unman, "What is Buddha?" Unman said, "A shit stick." And that's it. That's the whole cone. So, there is a lot of vulgarity in this as well. That, obviously the Buddha nature and enlightenment and purity and all that exists in all forms, whether it's a monastery or like covered with gold and a beautiful artwork, or a literal shit stick, whatever that is. You can imagine what it probably is. It's probably not exactly pretty to look at. So, this is what Zen comes from. And for people who, use that term lightly and don't really understand it, I think it's time for you to realize where this comes from. And, I'm personally, I'm not against or for these sort of practitioners and how they did these things back in the day. The world was a lot different 1,000 years ago in terms of how to enable spiritual enlightenment. We are now in a much more civilized world where I don't think we need to go to the lengths that these masters did back in the day. But there is wisdom in these lessons, despite how brutal they may be, how vulgar they may be, and the sort of transitory aspect of life, and where we can find, infinity in eternity, and that comes from the emptiness within. That's where the source of all life and all matter exists from. All that good shit. So that's all I have to say about this topic, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.